Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 17. Several days passed before McLaughlan found time to make another effort to bring Flicka in. Days in which he seemed to care nothing about what had happened or was going to happen. He was concerned only with his work. He drove the men hard, and Nell, too, had all she could do working with Rumba as well as attending to her housework. He ignored Ken. The 4 3-year-olds were coming along nicely. The daily routine of oats, grooming, exercising, filled out their muscles and put a fine sheen on their coats. They had reached the point where they pricked their ears and pranced gaily when their trainers whistled them into the corral in the morning. Gangway had stopped his bucking, and McLaughlan put the 4 of them through a daily workout down in the practice field, which included the swinging of polo sticks and whacking at the ball. On Sunday the family went to church in Cheyenne. There was the usual argument before going. Rob, who wanted to spend the morning sitting on the terrace reading the funny papers, said he thought they ought not to go because some officers might come out from the post. There's always a chance, you know, that someone might buy a pony. Not Sunday morning, said Nell firmly, and then she added with the one deep dimple in her right cheek showing, "But you don't have to go, dear. Your face isn't healed up yet. That's a good excuse. I'll go and take the boys." McLaughlan said, "Righto." 15 minutes later, when Nell was ready to go and Howard and Ken were dressed in their long grey flannel trousers and white shirts and small round white linen hats with narrow brims, he came running upstairs and roared indignantly, "Do you think I'll let you go to town and sit in that pew without me by your side?" As they waited for him to dress, the boys fidgeting, Nell explained to them that army officers are trained to be very particular how they look for the sake of their prestige. So they must all wait patiently. At last McLaughlan came down looking clean and handsome in his light grey flannel suit, with a soft felt hat tilted at just the right angle on his black hair and nothing but a small piece of adhesive on his cheekbone. Nell was in a dark green print, with turban and high-heeled pumps. Tim had washed the car, and the maroon paint and shining nickel was as bright as anything they passed on the Lincoln Highway. McLaughlan's habitual pace was 65 miles an hour. Today, with a slight feeling of pressure in him, he edged it up to 70. But as usual they were late, and made a commotion as they were ushered up the aisle of the church, and everyone seated listening to the first lesson being read. They dined in town with the Bartletts, and by the time they got back to the ranch, a number of visitors were there, and from then on the pleasant sociabilities of Sunday afternoon kept the place alive with cars coming and going, trays of bottles and glasses being carried in and out, and much talk and laughter. Children loved to hear the conversation of their elders, and Howard and Ken stuck close to their father and mother, and the group of officers and officers' wives, and listened to the story of Rocket's violent death told again and again, the loco bunch described, and the albino's prepotency and intractability discussed and commented upon. Loco was a word Ken had heard ever since he was born. "You're loco" meant the same as "you're crazy" or "what a goof." But the way it was being talked about now was different. Very serious somehow. He didn't get it. He sat on the low stone wall of the terrace, his legs dangling over the flower border, and watched a big bumblebee boring into a purple petunia blossom, while his elders gossiped. Gus and Ross and Tim had been talking about loco animals too. Last night Howard and Ken had spent an hour in the bunkhouse before bedtime, as they often did, listening to the men swap yarns, and the talk was all about what made animals loco in the first place. Tim told a tale of a little black colt who was chased by a pack of coyotes. The mother defended it bravely. But all through the night, the mare and the foal were in terror of their lives. They fought and ran, and turned to fight again, and by the morning the colt's hair had turned pure white, and it was loco. The bronco buster had a story to match that. He'd been talking about the horses he had on his own ranch. He had built up a band by catching wild mustangs, breaking them, now and then trading for a good mare. But to tell the truth, there warn't a real good horse on the place. Them catch colts, they're hard as hell to put in. I'd go out a hunting and maybe see a bunch strung out on the skyline, ridge runners. They get up on a high place where they can see you coming a mile off, and like as not, you never catch sight of 'em again. If you do get a few get 'em broke, you ain't got nothing. My top horse was one of them catch colts. He warn't no good. Cold-mouthed, couldn't feel the bit at all, just didn't savvy. I made up my mind. I'd get a real good colt, bred right, and raise him to be top horse. While I had a good mare, and I paid $10 for service by a government stud. Service comes free from government studs, said Gus. The $10 was the cost of hiring a trailer and transporting my mare. A year later she dropped a foal and she grew up a beauty. Long straight legs and eyes as soft as a woman's. Smart little fellow too. When he was a yearling, I rode his mother out to a homestead I had put under fence out by Centennial, and the colt come along with us. You know that country up there, them old cockeyed mountains going straight up into the sky, and nary a house or a road or a human being as far as you can see. I had set my fence the summer before, but that old wind got a whipping and a pulling it and laid it down for half a mile. I had a week's work cut out for me. It was while I was having a smoke after dinner one day that I seen this big mountain lion jump the yearling. The yearling was off there a ways, a grazing, close to a hillside, and that cat came a shooting down through the air and lit on top of that colt. Ever seen one of them lions stand as high as a newborn colt and scream like a woman, enough to curdle your blood? Lie in the trees, on top of rocks, leap on colts or horses as they go by. How can they kill a horse? Demanded Howard. It's a real neat trick. Leap on top the neck and bite in the base of the spine and hang on with their front claws. The rest of them's a swinging under their horse's head and neck, with the hind feet hooked under the horse's chin, clawing agin it. The weight of the critter twists the horse's head plumb around and breaks its neck. Down it goes and the rest is pickings. Did it kill your colt? Nope. He screamed and went down and rolled, and the old lady was grazing not so very far away, and she come on the run and went for the cat. Cats ain't brave, don't put up much of a fight. They'd rather run if they don't get the drop and kill with the first leap. It took to the tall timber, and by the time I got my gun and was looking for a shot, there wasn't a sign of it. But the colt could never stand no one on his back after that. When he got older, I did my best to break him, but he'd keep a looking round at me, shaking, jumping. Never did get him broke. He ended up plumb loco. All of this talk drifted hazily through Ken's mind, while he watched the bumblebee boring its way into a half-opened petunia bud. The bee was completely hidden, and the weight of it bowed the blossom almost to the ground. Ken waited to see it come out again. What a world that must be to get into, the very heart of a little flower. If he was a bumblebee now. Behind him on the terrace, the Major's wife was teasing Rob and Nell to come to a dance next Saturday night at the Post. "We never see you two in town," she said. "Not that I blame you. If I had a place like this—" "Remember last time we went to a dance at the Post?" said Rob, grinning. "Do I?" exclaimed Nell. "Last fall, and there was a flood while we were away." "I remember," yelled Howard. "The water was over the bridge coming back, and you couldn't drive over." Ken remembered too. It had been an exciting night. Just before bedtime, when he and Howard were sauntering home after a stroll with Gus, there had been a great roar, and a wave of water came down Lone Tree Creek and left a wide river in the meadow where there had only been a creek before. The dogs rushed down and barked at the water, and it covered the stone bridge that led up the cattle guard, and the parapets of the bridge too. "There we were about 4 in the morning," said Rob, "driving in from the highway, and my headlights picked up water in front, where there should have been a road, and we got out to see what had happened. And there was a river between us and home. For mercy's sake, screamed Mrs. Gilfillan. "What did you do?" "You should have seen us. The parapets of the bridge were only about 1 foot under water, so we took off our shoes and stockings, I rolled up my trousers, Nell picked up her skirts, and we waded across on the parapets, left the car where it was till morning." "Did you say a party at the post?" kidded Lieutenant Grubb. "And anyone going home sober enough to walk a couple of tight ropes over a river?" There was one of the jovial roars of laughter from everyone that made Howard and Ken join in without exactly understanding what the joke was. The bumblebee came out of the petunia and circled around, tasting several flowers in succession, then found one it liked and bored in again. Ken saw Paulie sitting over a golfer hole at the far side of the green. She was waiting for the gopher to stick its head out. She sat as still as a little brown statue, braced on her front paws, her eyes down into the hole. She would wait there 10 minutes, 15, 20, and at last the gopher wouldn't be able to stand it any longer, and he'd stick his head out to see if she'd gone away. They were talking about Rocket again. Major Gilfillan said, "No reason, of course, why there shouldn't be inherited insanity among animals, just as there is among human beings. But," Lieutenant Grubb interrupted, "how could you ever be sure what it is? There are all sorts of temperaments. Just sheer intractability or too high spirits would give you the same type. And that's not necessarily insanity, nor is it a bad thing. Take humans, for instance, a youngster too spirited to control." "It is a bad thing," interrupted the Major, "and you might as well call it insanity, for it amounts to an inability to adjust to environment. But when that type does adjust, you've got something super." "How many of them ever do?" "Most of them beat their heads against the wall until they beat their brains out." "Even so, I maintain that it's not insane for a freedom-loving individual, man or beast, to refuse to be subdued." Tim and the little bronco buster sauntered down the green, going to find the cows and bring them in for milking. Colonel Harris said, "My experience has been that the high-strung individual, the nervous, keyed-up type, is apt to be a fine performer. It's the solitary, or the queer fellow, that I'm afraid of. Show me a man who plays a lone hand, no natural gregariousness, you know, the lone wolf type, and I'll show you one who's apt to be skewy." Paulie was still sitting motionless over the gopher hole. Suddenly she made one smooth, lightning stroke of her paw across the opening, and then she crouched, struggling with something that was alive. Her head was turned sideways. She was crunching. Presently it wasn't alive any longer, and Paulie stood up, lifted her head with the dead gopher hanging from her jaws, and slowly trotted up the hill into the woods. "And in some cases an actual psychosis, no doubt about it," said the Major. The words danced in Ken's brain. He didn't know what they meant, but it didn't matter. He was too happy. That morning in church he had suddenly nudged Nell, and when she looked down into his beaming face, she realized the minister had just read the words, "Beautiful upon the mountains." Ken's lips silently formed the word flicker, and Nell smiled back. All week he had thought of nothing but flicker. She got into his conversation. He would be talking about she this and she that, and his father would suddenly roar, "What she?" His father was grim and angry with him, but not even that worried him. Every night, when he went to bed, he lay awake thinking of Flicker as long as he could. He would see her floating over the ravines, flattened in a leap, her long slim legs stretched forward and back until she seemed just a slightly curved line, suspended, and he would see her face as if it was close to his own. In reality, he had seen her close too, only once. That was the first time when she had fled past him, terrified, and had cast him in a glance. Then her face had been so close he could almost have leaned over and touched it. Some day, he thought, he would. He stroked her face. He'd brush out that untidy bang of hair. He'd put it neatly between her eyes. He'd put his own cheek right against her soft nose. At odd moments, a very ecstasy of possession filled him. Now, sitting on the terrace wall, his heart sang, and he hung his head for fear everyone could see the pride and joy shining out of his eyes. Behind him they were all shouting with laughter again, and he turned to see what it was about. His mother was telling something that made them laugh. She was saying that the reason Rob had looked so rakish driving to church that morning was the way he wore his hat. "It's the whole thing," she said, "the way a man wears his hat. It can make him look like a respectable gentleman." There were shouts at this. "Or a rake," she went on. "Bring him on," giggled Mrs. Gilfillan. "Or a pompous ass." The Major whacked Colonel Harris on the back and said, "Get up and bow, Colonel." "Or very, very careful," finished Nell, and the lieutenant said, "I never can be good, so I'm just careful." Then they got trying on hats in different ways. Canon Howard tried on hats too, strutting about, and Mrs. Gilfillan and Mrs. Grubb put on the boys' little white linen hats and sat there with them perched on their blonde heads. Later in the afternoon, McLaughlan stuck a tin can on the tip of one of the branches of a pine tree on the hill opposite, and the officers took their revolvers and practiced target shooting, standing on the terrace. Their father told the boys to get their 22s and give an exhibition of marksmanship, and at last he brought out the big guns, the express rifle and the Winchester, and the officers all tried shooting with them, and the long shells went crashing across the valley, chipping off pieces of the cliff half a mile away, until Tim came up from the barn, his face darker and redder than usual, saying that he couldn't milk the cows with the big guns booming over the barn. They'd kicked over 2 buckets already. Then Mrs. Grubb and Mrs. Gilfillan said they wanted to ride out and see the brood mares, so they all crowded into 2 automobiles, and McLaughlan led the way. When they found the brood mares, they stopped some distance off and got out, and McLaughlan promised that Banner would come out to meet them and do the honours. "How do you know he will?" asked Mrs. Gilfillan. "He always does." The mares stopped grazing and stood, alert, curious, and ready to run. Banner was amongst them. His head topped them all, and even from a distance, the men and women watching could feel the penetration of his eye. Suddenly, the big stallion moved towards them, ears pricked, inquiring eyes wide and fearless, and began to trot, his legs alternating in high, free, curving steps, his mane streaming, his tail up, "Flying all his flags," cried Nell. A roar and a cheer burst from the officers as the stallion, without breaking his trot, increased his pace and came down the wind to them like a bugle call. Banner halted 10 yards off and stood looking the group over. His golden coat blazed in the sunshine. "What an intelligent face!" exclaimed the colonel. McLaughlan, still in his grey suit and rakish hat, went forward to the stud, apologizing gravely for not having brought a bucket of oats in the car. Lying in bed that night, Ken remembered the way Banner had looked. Banner, the sire of Flicka. Flicka was the same burnished gold, the same beauty, the same flags flying. Oh, mine, my colt, my own, my very own. He wondered when his father would bring her in again. He had been wondering that every day when Gus put his round pink face in at the kitchen door and said, "What's today, boss?" But his father had planned other work. Meadows to be taken care of, water to be turned out of one ditch and into the other. Endless hours of work on the 3-year-olds that must be ready to ship in just a few days now. A new cattle guard being built at one of the railroad gates. But next morning, when Gus said, "What's today, boss?" McLaughlan gave the order for the day's work and then said, "And I think," and paused. Ken looked down to hide his excitement. He clenched his fists under the table. McLaughlan went on, "Tomorrow we'll get the yearlings in again, Gus, and cut out Ken's filly. I want to do that before Ross leaves. We may need his help. Tomorrow." That's the end of chapter 17.